Before 1982, the Morrisons were just another Philadelphia family. A father who worked double shifts at a factory that was slowly dying. A mother who performed daily miracles with a paycheck that never stretched far enough. 4 sons growing up in neighborhoods the government had forgotten existed. In that part of the city, life was never easy. But they had something that few families managed to keep: unity. Everything changed the day the paycheck disappeared from the mailbox. It wasn't just money. It was rent, groceries, the light bill that was already 2 months late. But more than that, it was proof that William Morrison could still provide for his family, that he still mattered. When that symbol vanished, something inside him shattered too. A chain of desperate decisions, born from wounded pride, humiliation, and fear, transformed an ordinary working family into the center of a tragedy that divides opinions to this day. This is not the story of a massacre. This is the story of the pain that preceded it. Philadelphia in the early months of 1982 was a city learning to live with its own decay. The factories that had once made it the workshop of the world stood like hollow monuments along the Delaware River, their windows dark, their smokestacks cold, their parking lots empty except for the weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. For a century, these buildings had promised something to the men and women who walked through their gates each morning: dignity through labor, identity through work, the simple American equation that said, if you showed up and did your job, the world would treat you fairly. That promise was breaking down, brick by brick, layoff by layoff, closed gate by closed gate. North Philadelphia bore the scars most visibly. The neighborhoods that stretched from Temple University up toward Hunting Park had been built for workers. Rows of brick row houses constructed in the 1920s for families who needed to be close to the plants where they earned their living. The houses were modest but solid. 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, small yards in back where children played and women hung laundry and men sat on summer evenings drinking beer and talking about nothing in particular. By 1982, those same streets had a different feeling, not abandoned, not yet, but wounded, tired. The kind of tiredness that settles into a place when hope starts leaking out and nothing arrives to replace it. The unemployment rate in some census tracts had climbed past 30%. But that number told only part of the story. It didn't count the men who'd stopped looking for work, who'd given up, who spent their days sitting on porches or in bars or in front of televisions that showed them a world they would never be part of. It didn't count the women who'd taken second and third jobs to make up for husbands who couldn't find first ones. It didn't count the teenagers who looked around at their neighborhoods and saw no future worth planning for. In places like this, a paycheck wasn't just money, it was identity. It was proof that you existed, that you mattered, that the world had a place for you. A man who worked was a man who could hold his head up, who could look his wife in the eye, who could tell his children that hard work meant something even when everything around them suggested otherwise. A man without work was something else, something less, something that American society had never learned to value or even to see. March came to North Philadelphia with cold rain and gray skies and the kind of damp that worked its way into bones and stayed there. The streets were slick with moisture that never quite dried, puddles forming in potholes that the city had stopped bothering to fix. The air smelled like diesel exhaust and wet garbage, and the particular mustiness of old buildings that had given up trying to keep the weather out. On Allegheny Avenue, in a row house that looked exactly like every other row house on the block, the Morrison family was preparing for another day. William Morrison Sr. woke at 4:47 a.m., the same time he'd been waking for 31 years. His body had learned the rhythm long ago, didn't need an alarm anymore, just rose from sleep at the appointed hour like a machine programmed for a single purpose. He lay in the darkness for a moment, listening to the silence of the house, feeling the warmth of the bed that he would leave behind for the cold morning air. The floor creaked beneath his feet as he walked to the bathroom. He knew which boards made noise and which didn't, had learned the geography of this house over decades of early mornings. But he'd stopped trying to be quiet years ago. Dorothy was gone now, 4 years in the ground at Eden Cemetery, and there was no one left to wake except himself. The face in the bathroom mirror was 53 years old, lined and weathered, carrying the evidence of 3 decades of factory work in its deep-set eyes and the gray that had conquered his temples and was advancing toward the crown. He studied that face for a moment, as he did every morning, looking for something he could never quite identify. Reassurance, maybe. proof that he was still the man he'd always been. He shaved with a safety razor that had belonged to his father, the blade scraping against stubble that grew back every night, no matter how closely he'd shaved the morning before. The ritual was comforting in its sameness: the hot water, the foam, the careful strokes, the splash of aftershave that stung for a moment and then faded to a clean, sharp scent. In the kitchen, he made coffee in the percolator that Dorothy had bought in 1969, a wedding anniversary gift that had outlasted the marriage only because death had intervened. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way he'd always made it, the way his father had made it, the way working men had been making coffee in these neighborhoods for generations. He stood at the window while the coffee cooled enough to drink, looking out at Allegheny Avenue in the gray pre-dawn light. Nothing moved, the street was empty, the houses dark, the world suspended in that quiet moment between night and day, when anything still seemed possible. This was his favorite time. Before the demands began, before the noise and the pressure and the constant small humiliations that made up a working man's life. In this moment, alone in his kitchen with his coffee and his silence, William Morrison could almost believe that everything was going to be all right. The moment never lasted. It wasn't supposed to. He drained his coffee, rinsed the cup, placed it in the rack to dry. He put on his coat, checked his pockets for keys and wallet, opened the front door, and stepped out into the cold March morning. The walk to the bus stop took 7 minutes. He'd timed it years ago, knew exactly how long he had before the 5:23 arrived, had calculated the latest possible moment he could leave the house and still make it with 30 seconds to spare. These small efficiencies mattered to William Morrison. They were evidence of control, proof that even in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic, a man could still impose order on his own small corner of existence. The bus was nearly empty at this hour, just a handful of other early workers slumped in seats with their eyes closed or staring out windows at nothing. William took his usual seat, third row on the right, and watched the city slide past as the bus carried him toward another day of work that meant everything and nothing at the same time. In a city broken by poverty, every paycheck was a lifeline, and the Morrison family was about to learn what happened when that lifeline was cut. The house on Allegheny Avenue had been in the Morrison family since 1952, when William's father had scraped together enough money for a down payment and signed papers that transformed him from a renter into an owner, from a temporary resident of this city into someone with roots. Robert Morrison had arrived in Philadelphia in 1923, part of the great tide of Black Americans who left the South seeking something better than sharecropping and Jim Crow. He'd found work at the Bud Company, making car bodies on an assembly line, learning to move his hands in the precise rhythms that mass production demanded. The work was hard, monotonous, occasionally dangerous, but it paid a steady wage. And in America, a steady wage was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Robert had married Bessie in 1929, just months before the stock market crashed, and the Depression began its long devastation of the American economy. They'd survived those years somehow. Robert working reduced hours when there were hours to work, Bessie taking in laundry and mending and whatever else women did to keep families fed when the men couldn't earn enough. They'd had 2 sons, William and his younger brother Charles, and they'd raised them with the simple faith that hard work and decency would be rewarded, that the American promise applied to Black families too, if they were patient enough and persistent enough, and willing to accept the slower pace of progress that seemed to be their lot. William had absorbed that faith without questioning it. He'd watched his father leave for work every morning, watched him come home every evening, tired but satisfied, watched the slow accumulation of small victories, a house of their own, a car that ran, food on the table, shoes for the boys, nothing extravagant, nothing excessive, just the basic dignities that separated the working class from the desperate poor. He'd followed his father into factory work, had gotten a job at Apex Manufacturing in 1951, the year he turned 22. The plant made industrial components, metal parts that went into machines that made other machines, the kind of work that nobody ever thought about, but that kept the whole economy running. William had started on the floor, running a lathe, and over 3 decades had worked his way up to shift supervisor, responsible for 20 men and the production quotas they had to meet. The work had given him everything he had. The house, paid off in 1971 after 20 years of monthly payments. The car, a 1975 Ford LTD that he kept running through careful maintenance and occasional prayer. The family he'd raised, Dorothy and 4 sons, in the same rooms where he'd been raised himself. Dorothy had been the center of it all. He'd met her at church in 1951, a young woman with serious eyes and a laugh that could fill a room when she let it loose. They'd married in 1953, had their first son in 1954, and had spent the next 25 years building a life together that wasn't remarkable by any external measure, but that felt, to both of them, like exactly what life was supposed to be. She had managed the household with the same precision that William brought to his work at the plant. Every dollar that came in was accounted for, allocated, spent wisely, or saved for future needs. She'd stretched his paychecks further than seemed mathematically possible, had performed the small daily miracles that kept a family of 6, fed and clothed and housed on a single factory income. The boys had grown up knowing they were loved, knowing they were expected to work hard and behave decently, knowing that their parents would sacrifice anything for their futures. William Jr., the oldest, had followed his father into factory work until the plant started closing. Marcus had joined the army, had seen things overseas that he didn't talk about. David had learned auto repair, had found a trade that would always be needed as long as people had cars. Raymond, the youngest, was still figuring things out at 24, living at home, trying to find his place in a world that seemed to have no place for young men without connections or credentials. Dorothy's death in 1978 had torn something loose in the family, had removed the center around which everyone orbited. William had mourned her. The way he did everything, quietly, internally, without the dramatic displays that some men use to advertise their grief. He'd continued working, continued going to church, continued maintaining the routines that had structured his life for decades. But something was different now. Something was missing, and everyone who knew him could see the absence even if they couldn't name it. The house on Allegheny Avenue reflected that absence in small ways. Dorothy had kept the place immaculate, had decorated with the framed photographs and small ornaments that transformed a house into a home. William maintained the cleanliness, but not the warmth. The photographs remained on the walls, but nothing new was ever added. The furniture stayed exactly where Dorothy had placed it, as if moving anything would be a betrayal, an admission that life was continuing when it had no right to. Raymond lived there now, in his old bedroom, paying no rent because he had no money to pay, and William couldn't bring himself to charge his own son for shelter. They coexisted more than they lived together. 2 men sharing a space, but rarely sharing words beyond the basic necessities of domestic life. The tension between them was never spoken, but it filled the rooms like humidity, like something you couldn't see but could always feel. William had been raised to believe that a man provided for himself, that depending on others was acceptable only in childhood and old age, and the narrow window of crisis in between. Raymond's extended presence in the house was evidence of some failure, though William could never decide if the failure was Raymond's or his own, or the world's that had given young men so few options. They ate breakfast together most mornings, William before dawn, and Raymond whenever he woke, which was rarely before 10. The meals were silent, functional, a transfer of nutrients rather than an occasion for connection. The television might be on, murmuring news or weather, or the empty chatter of morning shows, but neither man really watched it. It was just noise to fill the silence, evidence that the world outside still existed even if they had withdrawn from most of it. The other sons visited regularly, William Jr. and his wife Denise, usually on Sundays after church, Marcus when his night shift schedule allowed, David when he could get away from the garage. These visits were the closest thing to happiness that William permitted himself since Dorothy's death. The chance to see his grandchildren, to hear about his sons' lives, to remember for a few hours what it felt like to be part of something larger than his own solitary routine. The talk at these gatherings was careful, optimistic when it could be, realistic when it had to be. They discussed the economy in the abstract way that working people discuss things they can't control, noting plant closings and layoffs, and the general sense that things were getting worse without dwelling on what that might mean for their own futures. They talked about the neighborhood, the changes that were coming, some good and some bad, and most of them inevitable. They talked about sports and weather, and the small dramas of everyday life that gave conversation its texture, without ever requiring anyone to reveal too much. What they didn't talk about was money. The silence around money was a kind of courtesy in families like the Morrisons, an acknowledgement that everyone was struggling and nobody needed to be reminded of it. William knew that William Jr. was barely getting by. that the construction work was irregular and the bills were constant. He knew that Marcus's security job paid little more than minimum wage and offered no benefits. He knew that David was doing better than his brothers, but still lived paycheck to paycheck like everyone else in these neighborhoods. He knew all of this, and he said nothing about it, because saying something would require acknowledging his own situation, which was more precarious than anyone wanted to admit. The truth was that William Morrison Sr., after 31 years at Apex Manufacturing, was earning barely enough to survive. The wages hadn't kept up with inflation. They never did. Each year, the cost of living rose faster than the modest increases that the union managed to negotiate, so that a man who had earned a decent living in 1970 found himself struggling in 1982, even though the numbers on his paycheck were higher than they'd ever been. The house was paid off, thank God, so there was no mortgage to worry about. But property taxes rose every year. The utility bills climbed steadily upward as the old house required more and more energy to heat and cool. Food cost more than it had even 2 years ago. Everything cost more, and the paycheck that arrived every 2 weeks seemed to shrink even as the numbers stayed the same. William had always been careful with money, had learned from his father that you saved what you could and spent only what you must, that the difference between getting by and going under was often just a few dollars set aside for emergencies. He'd built a small cushion over the years, a few $100s in a savings account that he never touched except for genuine crises, a buffer against the unexpected that every working man needed and few could afford. That cushion had been eroding for the past 2 years, eaten away by the small emergencies that seemed to come more frequently as he got older. And the house got older, and everything around him showed the signs of wear that time imposes on all things. The roof had needed repair last spring, $500 he couldn't really spare, but couldn't afford not to spend. The furnace had required a new part in December, $200 gone in an afternoon. His car had needed work twice in the past 6 months, tires and then brakes, another $300 that he'd somehow scraped together. Each expense took a piece of the cushion. Each piece that disappeared meant less protection against the next emergency. By March of 1982, William Morrison's savings account held exactly $127.43. He knew the number precisely, checked it every week, watched it rise slightly after each paycheck and fall again as the bills came due. That number represented his margin for error, his protection against disaster, the thin line between dignity and desperation. It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. But it was what he had, and he'd learned long ago to work with what he had rather than wishing for what he didn't. The check that arrived every other Friday was the foundation of everything. $847.63. After taxes and deductions, the same amount it had been for the past 8 months. Not enough to get ahead, but just enough to stay even if nothing unexpected happened. William had built his entire life around that check, had calibrated every expense to fit within its limits, had created a system of small disciplines and careful economies that allowed survival, if not comfort. The check was more than money. It was proof that he still worked, still contributed, still had value in a society that measured value almost exclusively in economic terms. Every 2 weeks, that check arrived in his mailbox, and every 2 weeks, William Morrison received confirmation that he still existed, still mattered, was still a man in the full sense that America defined manhood. He never thought about what would happen if the check didn't arrive. The routines continued. William went to work every morning, performed his duties, supervised his crew, met the quotas that management imposed. He came home every evening, ate dinner alone or with Raymond, watched television until sleep took him, woke the next morning to do it all again. The sameness was comforting in its way, a structure that required no thought, a pattern that could be followed without requiring decisions or adaptations. At Bright Hope Baptist Church, he remained a deacon, attending services every Sunday, helping with the administrative tasks that kept a congregation running. The church had been his anchor since Dorothy's death, the one place where he still felt connected to something beyond himself. Pastor Williams knew him well, knew his grief and his struggle, and his quiet faith that somehow things would work out if you just kept doing the right thing. The pastor worried about William, had worried for years. He saw the loneliness behind the calm exterior, the exhaustion that had settled into his old friend's bones. He'd encouraged William to remarry, to find companionship, to let someone new into his life. William had listened politely and changed the subject, not offended, but not persuaded either. Dorothy had been his partner for 25 years. The idea of replacing her seemed impossible, even 4 years after her death. In the neighborhood, William was respected in the way that steady, reliable men are respected in communities where steadiness and reliability are increasingly rare. People knew he would help if asked, would lend a hand with repairs or advice or whatever else a neighbor might need. They knew he wouldn't gossip, wouldn't judge, wouldn't make a man feel small for needing assistance. They also knew he was proud, not arrogant, not boastful, but carrying that particular kind of pride that comes from having earned everything you have through your own labor. William Morrison didn't ask for help because asking for help meant admitting that he couldn't handle things himself. And a man who couldn't handle things himself was a man who had failed at the fundamental task of being a man. This pride was his strength and his vulnerability. It kept him going when easier men would have given up, kept him working when his body wanted rest, kept him maintaining the disciplines that held his life together. But it also isolated him, made it impossible to reach out, when reaching out might have prevented what was coming. March moved forward the way March always moves in Philadelphia, cold and wet and gray, each day indistinguishable from the one before. William worked his shifts, came home, slept, woke, worked again. The routine held. The structure remained intact. On the surface, everything was fine. A man going about his life, doing what he'd always done, waiting for the paycheck that would arrive on Friday like it always arrived on Friday. Beneath the surface, the pressure was building. The savings account balance that crept downward with each unexpected expense. The furnace that made strange noises sometimes and might need more work soon. The car that had 127,000 miles on it and couldn't last forever. The son living in his house who needed help finding work but wouldn't accept guidance. The loneliness that came in waves, usually at night, usually when there was no distraction from the absence that Dorothy had left behind. William Morrison was a man balanced on an edge, and he didn't even know it. The check that arrived every 2 weeks was the only thing keeping him from falling. On Thursday, March 11th, he went to work like any other day, performed his duties, came home, ate dinner, went to bed. On Friday, March 12th, he came home expecting to find his paycheck in the mailbox. The mailbox was empty. The walk from the bus stop to the house took 7 minutes. The same 7 minutes it always took, William's feet following the familiar path without requiring conscious direction. The March afternoon was cold, but not bitter. The sky overcast with the gray clouds that seemed to permanently cover the city this time of year, the air carrying that damp chill that worked its way through clothing and settled into joints and bones. William felt tired, the particular tiredness that came at the end of a Friday shift, when the body knew that rest was coming, that 2 days of not having to wake before dawn stretched ahead like a small luxury. His shoulders ached from the physical demands of the work, his feet from standing on concrete floors, his mind from the constant vigilance that supervising a crew required. But beneath the tiredness was something else. Anticipation. Friday was payday. The check would be in the mailbox, as it had been every other Friday for 31 years. He would deposit it tomorrow morning at the bank on Broad Street, would pay the bills that were due next week, would set aside a small amount for groceries, and perhaps a few dollars for the unexpected expenses that always seemed to arise. The routine was comforting in its predictability. Work, paycheck, bills, survival. The cycle had sustained him for his entire adult life, had given structure to his days and meaning to his labor. As long as the cycle continued, everything else could be managed. He turned onto Allegheny Avenue, saw his house halfway down the block, saw the mailbox at the end of the front walk where the letter carrier left the daily accumulation of bills and circulars and, every other Friday, the check that made everything possible. Something felt different as he approached. He couldn't identify what it was, couldn't point to anything specific, but there was a quality to the air that seemed wrong somehow, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He reached the mailbox, pulled down the small door, reached inside. His fingers found nothing but emptiness. For a moment, he simply stood there, his hand still in the mailbox, his mind struggling to process information that didn't fit the expected pattern. The check should be here. The check was always here. Every other Friday for 31 years, the check had been in this mailbox when he came home from work. He withdrew his hand, looked at it as if it might be holding something invisible, then reached back into the mailbox again. His fingers explored every corner, every surface, searching for the envelope that must be there, that had to be there, because any alternative was unthinkable. Nothing. William closed the mailbox door, opened it again, checked once more. The ritual was irrational, he knew that, but knowledge didn't stop him from repeating it 3 more times before finally accepting that the mailbox was empty, that no amount of checking would change that fact. He walked up to the front door slowly, the weight of confusion settling onto his shoulders alongside the exhaustion that had already taken residence there. His keys felt unfamiliar in his hands, as if they belonged to someone else, someone who lived a life where paychecks arrived on schedule and the world followed predictable rules. Inside, the house was quiet. Raymond was out somewhere, probably looking for work, or possibly just avoiding the tension that had built up between father and son over the past months. William was grateful for the solitude, wasn't sure he could face his youngest son right now, with this new uncertainty added to all the others. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd sat for 30 years, where he'd shared meals with Dorothy and the boys, where decisions had been made and problems had been solved and life had been lived in all its ordinary complexity. The table was empty now, just a surface of worn wood reflecting the gray light from the window, offering no comfort and no answers. Maybe there was a mistake. Maybe the postal service had delayed delivery, had gotten behind schedule, had simply failed to reach his mailbox today. These things happened sometimes, didn't they? The mail wasn't perfect. Nothing was perfect. He picked up the phone, dialed the number for the local post office, waited through several minutes of ringing before someone answered. The conversation was brief, frustrating, ultimately useless. Yes, the mail had been delivered today. Yes, Allegheny Avenue had been on the route. No, they couldn't say whether any specific piece of mail had been included in the delivery. If something was missing, he could file a complaint, but it would take time to investigate, and there was no guarantee of resolution. William hung up, sat for a moment, then picked up the phone again and dialed the number for Apex Manufacturing's payroll department. Another wait, another conversation, another piece of information that didn't help. The check had been mailed on Tuesday, the woman told him. First class, same as always. It should have arrived by now, but if it hadn't, they could put a stop payment on it and issue a new one. That would take 2 weeks, though. Procedures had to be followed. Forms had to be filled out. Nothing could be rushed. 2 weeks. William heard the words, but couldn't quite process them. 2 weeks meant 14 days without the money that paid his bills, bought his food, maintained the thin margin that separated him from financial catastrophe. 2 weeks meant explaining to the electric company that he couldn't pay on time, meant stretching the groceries that were already in the house, meant watching the savings account, already dangerously low, drain even further. 2 weeks meant being a man who couldn't meet his obligations, who had to ask for extensions and make excuses, who had failed at the basic task of providing for himself. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time, after hanging up the phone, staring at nothing, his mind moving in circles that led nowhere productive. The light in the room changed as the afternoon wore on, the gray deepening toward evening, shadows gathering in the corners where the windows couldn't reach. Where had the check gone? The question repeated in his mind, demanding an answer he couldn't provide. Had it been lost in the mail, delivered to the wrong address, stolen? The last possibility lodged in his mind and refused to leave. Stolen. Someone had reached into his mailbox, had taken the envelope that contained his wages, had walked away with money that he had earned through 31 years of labor, money that represented not just dollars and cents, but identity and dignity and the fundamental compact between a working man and the society he served. Who would do such a thing? Who would steal from a man like William Morrison, who had never hurt anyone, who had spent his entire life following the rules and doing the right thing? But he knew the answer, even if he didn't want to admit it. He'd heard the stories, same as everyone else in the neighborhood. Mail theft had become common in North Philadelphia, a plague that targeted the most vulnerable, the working people whose paychecks and benefit checks arrived on predictable schedules, easy targets for thieves who knew exactly when and where to look. Marcus Garrett's name floated up from his memory, though he couldn't say exactly where he'd heard it. A man who ran a crew, who operated in these neighborhoods, who made his living taking things that didn't belong to him. One of those names that everyone knew and no one talked about, because talking about it meant acknowledging that there was nothing anyone could do, that the police didn't care, and the city didn't help, and ordinary people were on their own, against predators who faced no consequences for their crimes. The anger came then, slowly at first, then building like a wave. Someone had stolen from him. Someone had taken what he'd earned, had violated his home even without entering it, had reached into his life and extracted something irreplaceable. But underneath the anger was something worse: shame. A man should be able to protect what was his. A man should be able to prevent this kind of violation. The fact that William Morrison had failed to protect his own paycheck, had allowed some thief to simply take it from his mailbox, felt like an indictment of his manhood itself. He thought about Dorothy, about what she would say if she were here. She would be practical, would focus on solutions rather than recriminations, would remind him that they'd survived worse than this and would survive this too. She'd been the steady one, the one who could look at a problem without letting it overwhelm her, who could always find the next step even when the path forward seemed impossible to see. But Dorothy was gone, and William was alone, and the shame of having his wages stolen mixed with the grief that never fully faded to create something toxic, something that settled into his chest like a weight he couldn't lift. The front door opened around 6 o'clock. Raymond came in, shaking water from his jacket, stomping his feet on the mat. He looked at his father, sitting alone in the darkening kitchen, and his expression shifted from neutral to concerned. "Pop, you okay?" William didn't answer for a long moment. The words he needed to say were stuck somewhere in his throat, blocked by the shame that made speaking them feel like confession of a crime he hadn't committed. "The check didn't come," he finally said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, flattened, emptied of the authority it usually carried. Raymond's face showed confusion, then understanding, then something that might have been pity. William looked away, unable to bear that expression on his son's face. "What do you mean it didn't come?" "I mean, it wasn't in the mailbox. I called the post office, called the plant. They're going to reissue it, but that takes 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Raymond absorbed this information, processing the implications. "Pop, what about the bills? What about—" "I know what about." William's voice was sharper than he intended, the anger finding an outlet that wasn't fair but was available. "I know what we need to pay and when we need to pay it. I've been doing this for 31 years. I think I understand how bills work." Raymond fell silent, recognizing the warning signs of his father's temper. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Allegheny Avenue. "Did you check with the neighbors? Maybe it got delivered to the wrong house." William shook his head. "Checked all the boxes on my side of the street. Nobody has it." "So, what happened to it?" The question hung in the air. William looked at his son, saw the young man he'd raised, the child who had grown into an adult without quite becoming the man that William had hoped for. He wanted to tell Raymond about the suspicions forming in his mind, about Marcus Garrett and mail theft, and the sick feeling that someone had deliberately targeted him, had reached into his life and taken what was his. But saying those things would mean admitting that he was powerless, that there was nothing he could do about it, that some thief had outsmarted him and gotten away with his money, and William Morrison wasn't ready to make that admission to his youngest son. "I don't know," he said instead. "Just got lost, I guess." These things happen sometimes. They both knew he was lying, but Raymond let it go, retreated to his room with a mumbled offer to help however he could. William remained at the kitchen table as the darkness fully settled in, as the streetlights flickered on outside, as the house grew quiet with the particular silence of a place that holds only grief and waiting. He couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind returned to the empty mailbox, to the check that should have been there and wasn't, to the question of who had taken it and why he hadn't been able to prevent it. The shame was worst in the darkness, when there were no distractions, when the world contracted to the confines of his bedroom and the thoughts he couldn't escape. 53 years old, and he couldn't even protect a paycheck. 31 years of work, and some street criminal had stolen his wages as easily as picking fruit from a tree. He thought about his father, Robert, who had survived the Depression and raised a family and built something solid in a city that hadn't always welcomed black men who wanted to be treated with dignity. What would Robert say if he could see his son now, lying awake in the darkness because someone had stolen his paycheck from a mailbox? He would be ashamed. That was the thought that kept returning, the one that hurt the most. Robert Morrison had faced real hardships, real obstacles, had overcome discrimination and poverty, and the daily indignities of being a black man in mid-20th century America. And he had never let any of it defeat him, had never let the world see him as anything less than a man who met his obligations and provided for his family. William had failed where his father had succeeded. That's what it felt like, lying there in the darkness. He had allowed himself to become a victim, had let some thief reduce him to someone who couldn't pay his bills, who had to ask for extensions, who had to explain to his sons that the check didn't come and he didn't know what to do about it. The morning came eventually, as mornings always do, gray light seeping through the curtains to reveal a day that William didn't want to face. He got up anyway, went through the motions of his morning routine, made coffee that he couldn't taste, stared out the window at a street that looked exactly like it had every other morning. But that somehow felt different now, threatening in a way it never had before. The weekend passed in a fog. He went to church on Sunday, sat in his usual pew, heard Pastor Williams' sermon without really listening to the words. People spoke to him afterward, the normal pleasantries of congregational life, and he responded with the expected phrases while his mind remained elsewhere, trapped in the loop of empty mailbox and stolen check and shame that wouldn't fade. On Monday morning, the information he'd been dreading finally arrived. Charles Wheeler, a deacon at Bright Hope Baptist, who worked at a check-cashing place on Germantown Avenue, pulled William aside after the morning prayer meeting. "Brother Morrison," Charles said, his voice low, his eyes scanning the room to make sure no one else was listening. "I need to tell you something about your check." The words hit William like a physical blow, confirming what he'd suspected and feared since Friday afternoon. A young man came in Friday, trying to cash it. Had your name on it from Apex Manufacturing. The ID wasn't good enough, so my manager turned him away, but I saw the check before he left. It was yours. Who was he? William's voice was steady, but something beneath it had started to shift. Something cold and hard that hadn't been there before. Charles shook his head. I didn't recognize him, but my manager did. Said his name was Kenneth something. Runs with Marcus Garrett's people. There it was. The confirmation. A name attached to the crime. A face that could be identified. A crew that was known throughout the neighborhood for exactly this kind of predation. William thanked Charles, left the church, walked home through streets that felt different now than they had 3 days ago. The anger that had been building since Friday was solidifying into something else. Something harder and more dangerous. He'd spent his whole life believing in the system. Believing that if you worked hard and followed the rules, the world would treat you fairly. He'd trusted the mail to deliver his paycheck. Trusted the police to protect his neighborhood. Trusted the basic structures of society to function the way they were supposed to function. That trust was gone now, replaced by something that felt like clarity, like finally seeing the world as it really was, rather than as he'd always wanted it to be. The police wouldn't help. He knew that without even trying. Property crimes in neighborhoods like this were paperwork exercises, reports filed and forgotten, statistics gathered for purposes that had nothing to do with justice. Marcus Garrett and his crew had been operating for years, preying on working people, and nothing had ever happened to them, because nothing ever happened to people like them in places like this. If William Morrison wanted justice, he would have to create it himself. That night, he called his sons. The family meeting happened on Tuesday evening in the living room of the house on Allegheny Avenue. William sat in his chair, the same chair he'd sat in for 30 years, while his 4 sons arranged themselves around the room. William Jr. on the couch, Marcus standing by the window, David in the chair by the fireplace, Raymond on the floor with his back against the wall. He told them everything. The empty mailbox, the calls to the post office and the plant, the information from Charles Wheeler, the name, Kenneth, and the organization he worked for, Marcus Garrett's crew. When he finished, the room was silent. William Jr. spoke first. "Pop, we can help with money. Denise and I can spare something, and it's not about the money." William's voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made everyone pay attention. It's about what they did, what they think they can do. These men, Garrett and his people, they've been preying on this neighborhood for years, stealing from working people, taking what others have earned, and nothing happens to them. The police don't care. The city doesn't care. They just keep taking and taking because they know nobody will stop them. He looked around the room, meeting each of his sons' eyes in turn. Your grandfather came to this city in 1923, left everything behind because he believed that up here, a black man could work hard and be treated with dignity. He spent 35 years in that factory, never missed a day, raised his family, built something real. And he passed that belief down to me, that if you work hard, if you follow the rules, the world will treat you fair. His voice cracked slightly, then steadied. I spent 31 years believing that. But I'm starting to think he was wrong. I'm starting to think the world doesn't treat you fair unless you make it treat you fair. Unless you stand up and say this far and no farther, and anyone who crosses that line pays the price. Pop. Marcus spoke, his military training giving his voice a calm that contrasted with the tension in the room. What exactly are you saying? William looked at his son, the veteran, the one who had seen violence and understood what it cost. I'm saying that Marcus Garrett and his people need to learn that there are consequences, that you can't just take from working people and walk away, that some things have a price. The silence stretched. Outside, a car passed on Allegheny Avenue, its headlights briefly illuminating the curtains. The conversation continued deep into the night. The sons argued against it at first, tried to talk their father out of whatever he was planning, pointed out the risks and the consequences and the likelihood of things going wrong. But as the hours passed, as William explained what he'd learned about the Garrett organization and what he believed needed to be done about it, the arguments became less forceful, the objections less certain. Each son had his own reasons for eventually agreeing. William Jr. thought about his wife and children, about the neighborhood they were growing up in, about the future that would be available to them if things continued as they were, if criminals like Marcus Garrett were allowed to operate without consequences. Marcus thought about the skills he'd learned in the army, about the violence he'd seen overseas, and the violence he saw on these streets, about the difference between sanctioned killing and unsanctioned killing, and whether that difference really mattered when innocent people were being victimized. David thought about his customers at the garage, the working people who brought their aging cars in for repairs they could barely afford, people who'd been stolen from and cheated and victimized in 100 different ways by men like Marcus Garrett, people who deserve protection that the system refused to provide. Raymond thought about his father, about the man who'd fed him and housed him for months without complaint, about the shame and anger he'd seen in that man's eyes since Friday, about what it meant to stand with family, when standing with family might cost you everything. By the early hours of Wednesday morning, the decision was made. The events of March 19, 1982, took place over 11 hours and resulted in 13 deaths. The details of that night are not the subject of this account. What matters is what came after. The investigation that never solved the case, the family that was never charged, the community that never spoke about what everyone suspected, and the wounds that never fully healed. The bodies were discovered starting at 6:15 a.m. on Saturday, March 20th, 11 in a warehouse on American Street, 2 more in other locations across North Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Police Department responded with unusual intensity, the scope of the violence demanding attention, even in a city that had learned to accept a certain level of bloodshed as normal. Detective Franklin Hayes led the investigation. A 22-year veteran of homicide, Hayes had seen enough death to have developed a certain detachment, a professional distance that allowed him to work cases without being consumed by them. But walking through the American Street warehouse that morning, counting bodies, he felt something he rarely felt anymore, a grudging respect for whoever had done this. The operation had been planned meticulously. The approach routes, the timing, the coordination between multiple shooters, it all spoke to military-level discipline and preparation. This wasn't street violence, wasn't gang warfare, wasn't the chaotic bloodshed that usually filled his case files. This was something else entirely. Within days, the investigation had identified the victims as members of Marcus Garrett's criminal organization, a crew that had been preying on North Philadelphia for years through mail theft, drug dealing, and various other enterprises that exploited working people who had no other options for recourse. The question of motive led inevitably to the question of victims, not the men who had died, but the people they had victimized over the years, the stolen paychecks, the ruined families, the small tragedies that accumulated like drops of water until they formed an ocean of suffering. The Morrison name emerged within a week. William Morrison's stolen paycheck. The complaint filed with the Postal Service. The information from the check-cashing place on Germantown Avenue. The connections formed a chain that pointed in a single direction, even if the links were circumstantial rather than conclusive. Detective Hayes visited the house on Allegheny Avenue on March 25th. He found William Morrison waiting for him on the porch, as if he'd been expecting this visit, as if he'd known it was inevitable from the moment the first shot was fired. The interview was respectful, almost cordial. Two men who understood each other, separated by a badge and a suspicion that couldn't be proven. William answered every question with calm politeness, provided an alibi that his sons would corroborate, expressed appropriate shock at the violence that had occurred in his neighborhood. Hayes left, knowing he would never solve this case. The investigation continued for 3 months, following every lead, interviewing every witness, analyzing every piece of physical evidence. But North Philadelphia wasn't the kind of place where people cooperated with police, especially police investigating the deaths of men like Marcus Garrett. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. No one would say anything even if they had. In June of 1982, the case was officially classified as unsolved, 13 men dead, and no one held accountable in any courtroom. But accountability came in other forms. William Morrison returned to work at Apex Manufacturing on March 23rd, 3 days after the massacre. He punched in at his usual time, supervised his crew, met the production, quotas that management demanded. From the outside, nothing had changed. He was the same steady, reliable man he'd always been, showing up every day, doing his job, keeping his head down. Inside was a different matter. The nightmares started within a week. Not every night, but often enough that sleep became something to be feared rather than welcomed. Images that came without warning, sounds that echoed long after waking, the smell of gunpowder and blood that seemed to cling to him no matter how many showers he took. He didn't talk about it. Couldn't talk about it. Not to his sons who had shared the experience, and not to anyone else who hadn't. The silence around that night was absolute, a wall that the family had constructed together and that none of them would breach. But silence has a weight. It accumulates over time, pressing down on those who carry it, deforming the shape of their lives in ways that aren't always visible from the outside. William became more isolated as the months passed. The church visits continued, the surface relationships maintained, but something essential had withdrawn, had retreated to a place where no one else could reach. He sat in his pew on Sunday mornings and heard the sermons about forgiveness and grace, and he wondered if those words applied to him anymore, if he had placed himself beyond their reach through the choices he had made. Pastor Williams noticed the change, tried to address it in the indirect way that ministers often do, approaching the subject through parables and general observations rather than direct questioning. William listened, nodded, said nothing meaningful in response. The wall held. His sons dealt with the aftermath in their own ways. William Jr. threw himself into his family, spending every available moment with his wife and children, as if their presence could somehow balance the weight of what he'd done. He took extra shifts when they were offered, worked until exhaustion forced him to stop, ran from the thoughts that caught up with him anyway in the quiet hours of the night. Marcus, the veteran, was perhaps the most affected despite his training. He'd killed before, in places with names that most Americans couldn't pronounce, following orders that were supposed to carry the weight of governmental authority. This was different. This was personal. This was choice rather than duty, and the difference haunted him in ways that combat never had. He started drinking more than he should have, spending evenings in bars where no one knew him, seeking the numbness that alcohol provided. The security job continued, the overnight shifts at the warehouse in Kensington, but he called in sick more often than he used to, found himself standing outside the building at 2 a.m., unable to remember how he'd gotten there. David, the quiet one, retreated further into his work. The garage became his sanctuary, the place where he could focus on problems that had solutions, where a broken engine could be fixed and a worn brake pad could be replaced and the world made sense in ways it no longer made sense outside. He spoke less than he ever had, even to his wife, who watched his silence deepen without understanding its source. She asked questions that he couldn't answer, expressed concerns that he couldn't address, eventually accepted that there were parts of her husband that would remain forever closed to her. Raymond's transformation was the most dramatic, perhaps because he'd been the least formed before that night. The experience of violence, of discovering what he was capable of, had shocked something loose in him, had forced him to confront questions about himself that he'd been avoiding his entire adult life. He stopped drifting, got his GED within 6 months, enrolled in community college, started working toward a degree in social work. The path forward that had always seemed invisible to him now appeared with crystalline clarity. He would spend his life trying to prevent young men from making the choices that Marcus Garrett's crew had made, that he and his family had made in response. The neighbors suspected. Of course they suspected. In communities like North Philadelphia, secrets are both kept and known simultaneously, understood without being acknowledged, passed through silences and meaningful looks, and the particular way that people don't ask questions they don't want answered. William Morrison noticed the change in how his neighbors treated him. The respect was still there, perhaps even intensified, but it was accompanied now by something that might have been fear or awe, or simply the recognition that this was a man capable of things that most people only imagined. Nobody talked about what had happened. Nobody had to. At Bright Hope Baptist Church, the congregation prayed for peace in the neighborhood, thanked God that the violence that had claimed 13 lives hadn't spread further, didn't speculate publicly about who might have been responsible or why. Charles Wheeler, who had provided the information that identified William's stolen check, never mentioned that conversation again, not to William, not to anyone. He understood his role in what had happened, understood the weight of information that leads to death, and he carried that understanding silently for the rest of his life. The years passed. The investigation faded into cold case files. The warehouse on American Street was eventually demolished, replaced by a vacant lot that became overgrown with weeds, a physical erasure of the place where 11 men had died. Mail theft in North Philadelphia dropped dramatically in the months following the massacre, a development that nobody talked about but everyone noticed. Other criminals, seeing what had happened to the Garrett organization, reconsidered their own operations, found other ways to make money that didn't involve stealing paychecks from working families. Was that justice? The question didn't have a clean answer. 13 men were dead, some of them deeply guilty, others merely associated with the guilty, all of them beyond any possibility of change or redemption. Their families scattered, relocated, tried to build new lives in places where the Morrison name meant nothing, and the events of March 19, 1982, were just another crime story in a country full of crime stories. The Morrison family remained in North Philadelphia, continued their lives in the same neighborhoods where they had always lived, maintained the appearances that allowed them to function as members of a community that knew what they'd done without ever saying so. William Morrison Sr. worked at Apex Manufacturing until the plant closed in 1987, a victim of the same economic forces that had been squeezing the life out of American manufacturing for decades. He was 58 years old, too young to retire, and too old to easily find new employment. The savings that had been nearly depleted in 1982 had been rebuilt through years of careful economy, enough to survive on while he figured out what came next. What came next was a series of smaller jobs, security guard and janitor, and the various positions available to older men who still needed to work, but no longer had the skills or connections that the new economy demanded. He did each job with the same diligence he'd brought to the factory floor, never complaining, never explaining, just showing up and doing what was required until the next position ended and the search began again. He died on January 17, 1994, in his sleep, in the bed where he'd slept since 1952. Heart attack, the coroner said, massive and sudden, probably painless. He was 65 years old. The funeral at Bright Hope Baptist drew more than 300 people, filling the church and spilling out onto the sidewalk. They came to pay respects to a man who had been a deacon for decades, who had coached youth baseball, who had helped neighbors with repairs, who had represented something solid and dependable in a community that had precious little of either. Nobody mentioned the massacre. Nobody had to. What William Morrison had done was woven into the fabric of how the community remembered him, inseparable from the man who had worked 31 years at the factory and raised 4 sons and lost his wife too young and kept going anyway. Pastor Williams delivered the eulogy, speaking about faith and endurance and the struggles of a life lived in circumstances that most Americans never had to face. He didn't try to make William a saint. He simply told the truth about a complicated man who had done both good and terrible things, who had loved his family and served his community, and crossed lines that most people never have to consider crossing, The sons sat in the front pew, 4 men in their 30s and 40s now, each carrying the weight of what they'd done and who they'd become because of it. They didn't cry. They'd done their crying in private, in the years since that night, in the dark hours when the memories came unbidden and the questions without answers repeated themselves endlessly. After the service, after the burial at Eden Cemetery next to Dorothy, after the gathering at the house on Allegheny Avenue, where neighbors brought food and offered condolences, the 4 brothers sat together in the living room, where they'd made the decision that changed everything. They didn't talk about that night. They never did, not directly. But they talked about their father, about the man he'd been before 1982, and the man he'd become after, about the way he'd carried the weight of what they'd done, without ever letting it crush him, without ever expressing regret or doubt, or any of the emotions that might have suggested weakness. He believed he did the right thing, Marcus said finally, breaking a silence that had stretched for several minutes. He believed it until the day he died. Did he? William Jr. asked. Marcus shrugged. Does it matter? He made a choice. We all made a choice. We live with it. They lived with it. More than 40 years have passed since the events of March 1982. The warehouse on American Street is gone, replaced by condominiums that house people who have no idea what happened on that ground. The row house on Allegheny Avenue is still standing, owned now by a family who bought it in 1996 and raised their children there without knowing its history. William Morrison Jr. is 76 years old, still living in North Philadelphia, watching his grandchildren and great-grandchildren grow up in a city that has changed in ways his father never imagined. He doesn't talk about what happened. When asked, he changes the subject, finds something else to discuss, maintains the silence that has protected the family for 4 decades. Marcus Morrison died in 2008, lung cancer, 57 years old. He'd spent his final years working at a veterans center, helping other men who'd come back from wars with wounds that didn't show. He never married, never had children. He said once that he didn't think he deserved that kind of happiness, and nobody argued with him. David Morrison had a stroke in 2019, lives in an assisted care facility now. His wife visits every day, holds his hand, doesn't ask questions about the past that he can no longer answer anyway. Raymond Morrison turned his life around after that night. He got his degree, became a social worker, spent 30 years trying to prevent young men from making the choices that lead to violence and prison and early death. He retired in 2018, writes occasionally about poverty and crime and the failures of systems that are supposed to protect people but don't. He's the only one who ever spoke publicly about what happened in a 2015 interview with a journalist researching urban violence. "I'm not going to confirm or deny anything specific," Raymond said. "What I will say is that in communities like ours, where the police don't protect you and the government doesn't help you and criminals prey on you because they know there are no consequences, sometimes people reach a breaking point. Sometimes they decide that if the system won't deliver justice, they'll deliver it themselves." He paused, looking out the window. Was it right? I don't know. I've spent 30 years asking myself that question. What I know is that after that night, the mail theft in our neighborhood dropped to almost zero. For a few years, people in North Philadelphia could walk to their mailboxes without worrying. That meant something. Whether it was worth the cost, I still can't say. The case of the American Street Massacre remains officially unsolved. The files sit in a police warehouse somewhere, yellowing paper and cardboard boxes. Testimony to an investigation that came close but never quite arrived. Every few years, someone writes about it. A journalist or researcher or true crime podcaster discovers the case, digs through the old records, speculates about who was responsible and why. The Morrison name comes up sometimes, always with caveats, always with acknowledgement that nothing was ever proven. The truth is both simpler and more complicated than any article can capture. A man worked for 31 years. His paycheck was stolen. The system failed to help him. He made a choice. His sons made the same choice. 13 men died. Justice was served and justice was violated, depending on how you define justice, depending on whose suffering you count, depending on whether you believe that some crimes demand responses that the law cannot provide. North Philadelphia has changed since 1982. The factories are gone, the demographics have shifted. The neighborhood has gentrified in some places and remained impoverished in others. New families have moved in, Families who never heard of Marcus Garrett or William Morrison, who walked to their mailboxes without knowing the history of why that simple act was once so dangerous. But some things remain. Working people still struggle. Criminals still prey on the vulnerable. Systems still fail the people they're supposed to protect. And sometimes, when pushed far enough, ordinary people still discover what they're capable of. That's the legacy of William Morrison and the events of March 1982. Not an answer to any question about justice or vengeance, but a reminder that the questions exist, that they have always existed, that they will continue to exist as long as there are gaps between the justice we promise and the justice we deliver. Sometimes it isn't a big event. Sometimes it's a small detail that breaks an entire life. A paycheck, an empty mailbox, a man who decided that enough was enough. Everything that followed came from that moment, that discovery, that breaking point that no one saw coming until it was already past. If you've stayed with this story until now, if you felt something of what the Morrison family felt, leave your like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not because it's entertainment, because it's a mirror. What would you have done? Where do you draw the line? When does the system fail so completely that you stop believing in it? These aren't hypothetical questions. They're being answered right now in cities and neighborhoods where the distance between protection and abandonment grows wider every day. The Morrison family answered them in 1982. They lived with those answers for the rest of their lives. We're all still living with them, too.